The Krynn Empire had, in its infinite wisdom and approximately 12,000 years of stellar conquest, determined that Verith 9 represented a critical strategic choke point in the outer terminus sector. This determination came after roughly 6 minutes of computer analysis and 3 committee meetings, which was actually quite efficient by galactic bureaucratic standards. The planet itself sat at the intersection of 4 major hyperspace lanes, making it theoretically perfect for a forward observation post. What the computers had failed to adequately convey, and what the committees had simply ignored because nobody actually reads environmental reports, was that Verith 9 was approximately 97% swamp. Not the pleasant, mysterious kind of swamp that features in adventure holos. The miserable kind, the kind where the water was too murky to see through, too warm to be refreshing, and had a smell that could only be described as enthusiastically biological. The native flora had evolved to be as inconvenient as possible, featuring thorns that could puncture military-grade boots and vines that seemed personally offended by the concept of clear pathways. The fauna, meanwhile, had taken the evolutionary approach of being either venomous, carnivorous, or sufficiently annoying to make one wish they were venomous or carnivorous instead. The atmospheric conditions were technically within acceptable parameters for most oxygen-breathing species. Technically, the humidity hovered at 98% on a good day. The temperature remained stubbornly tropical, never cool enough to be comfortable in armor, never hot enough to justify climate-controlled environments without seeming weak. Rain fell with the regularity of a metronome, sometimes light mist, sometimes torrential downpour, but always present in some form. The sky maintained a perpetual overcast, grey clouds that seemed to take personal satisfaction in blocking any cheerful sunlight. Commander Vectis of the Krynn Imperial Forward Operations Division had the distinct honor of being the first military officer to set foot on Verith 9's soggy surface. He lasted approximately 4 hours before filing his first complaint. By the end of the first week, he had filed 17 more. By the end of the first month, he had stopped filing complaints because the futility of bureaucratic process had finally broken through his military conditioning. His superiors ignored the complaints anyway, having decided that strategic value outweighed personnel comfort, which was easy to decide when you were sitting in a climate-controlled office 3-star systems away. The base itself was a testament to Krynn engineering excellence, a prefabricated military installation designed to withstand plasma bombardment, kinetic strikes, and atmospheric extremes ranging from sulfuric acid rain to solar radiation that could cook flesh in seconds. What it had not been designed to withstand was persistent, enthusiastic moisture. The kind of moisture that found its way into sealed containers through processes that defied physics. The kind that made electronic equipment spark in ways that were both fascinating and deeply concerning. The kind that turned every surface slippery and made every fabric feel like it had been recently sneezed on by something with poor hygiene. The Krynn soldiers, who had trained for combat in vacuum, toxic atmospheres, and even the dreaded high-gravity death worlds, where every step felt like carrying a small mountain, found themselves completely unprepared for simple discomfort. Private Jack developed a fungal infection that medical databases insisted was impossible in silicon-based life forms. The medical officer spent 3 days running tests before admitting defeat and prescribing something that might work, or might just make the infection glow in the dark. Specialist Morvan discovered that his exoskeleton had somehow begun corroding, despite being made from an alloy that could survive atmospheric re-entry, and had once been used as armor plating on warships. The base commander's personal quarters sprouted something that might have been mold, or might have been a new form of sentient life. Nobody wanted to investigate closely enough to determine which, and eventually they just sealed that section of the building. Equipment failures became so routine that the technical staff stopped logging them individually and just maintained a running count on the mess hall wall, updated daily like a countdown to sanity's end. 43 sensor arrays had failed, their sensitive electronics reduced to expensive paperweights. 67 communication relays had corroded into abstract art. 15 defensive turrets had jammed so thoroughly that disassembly revealed growths inside the barrels that might have been plant life. 123 personal environmental suits had developed leaks in seals that were supposedly good for a century of use. The numbers climbed with depressing regularity. The swamp, it seemed, took the presence of advanced military technology as a personal challenge and was winning decisively. Morale, that intangible quality that military psychologists insisted could be maintained through proper leadership and unit cohesion, collapsed entirely after 3 months. It was not a dramatic collapse featuring mutiny or desertion. It was a quiet, soggy dissolution of the will to care about anything. Soldiers stopped polishing their armor because it would just get covered in algae within an hour. Officers stopped conducting inspections because everyone looked equally miserable anyway, and pointing it out just made everyone feel worse. The base cook stopped trying to make the rations appetizing, because what was the point when everything tasted like swamp anyway? Even the motivational posters, initially placed with genuine hope of maintaining spirits, had become objects of mockery. One featuring a Krynn warrior proudly holding a banner now had speech bubbles drawn on it, suggesting anatomically unlikely activities. The psychological reports made for depressing reading. Stress levels exceeded acceptable parameters. Sleep quality had degraded to the point where soldiers were technically functional, but moved through their duties like automated drones. Social cohesion had fractured into small groups of the equally miserable seeking comfort in shared suffering. Requests for transfer had reached numbers that would require evacuating the entire base twice over. The base psychologist recommended immediate rotation of personnel, enhanced recreational facilities, and possibly just abandoning the entire operation before someone did something regrettable. The final straw came when Command sent an inspection team to evaluate the base's operational readiness. The inspectors arrived in clean uniforms, crisp and pressed, their armor gleaming with polish that suggested they had people whose entire job was making things shine. They stepped off their shuttle into ankle-deep mud and immediately understood everything they needed to know. One inspector took 3 steps, slipped, caught himself on a vine that left thorns in his glove, and stood there in the rain that had started the moment they landed, water running down his helmet, and simply sighed. Their report, filed within 6 hours of arrival and composed while they waited in the shuttle with the engines running and the climate control set to aggressively comfortable, recommended immediate evacuation and permanent abandonment of the position. The strategic value of the location, they noted with admirable understatement, did not outweigh the complete erosion of combat effectiveness caused by environmental factors. They used phrases like operational compromise, personnel sustainability concerns, and equipment reliability issues. What they meant was that the swamp had won, and everyone knew it. Commander Vectis received the evacuation order with more emotion than he had displayed in his entire military career. He actually smiled, his mandibles spreading in a way that his troops had not seen since deployment. His soldiers, upon hearing the news, managed something between a cheer and a relieved sob. They left behind everything that was not essential, which turned out to be approximately 80% of the base. Nobody wanted to spend an extra minute packing equipment that had betrayed them so thoroughly. The defensive turrets could rust. The sensor arrays could become homes for whatever wanted them. The buildings could sink into the swamp. They took personal items, weapons, and their dignity, and left everything else as an offering to the planet that had defeated them. Within 48 hours, Verath 9 was once again uninhabited by sentient life. The Krynn Empire updated its stellar databases with a new classification, strategically irrelevant due to environmental hostility. The galactic community, which paid attention to such things through networks of gossip, official reports, and the kind of casual information sharing that happened in bars across 1,000 worlds, noted the abandonment with mild interest and then immediately forgot about it. After all, the galaxy contained approximately 400 billion stars. One miserable swamp planet was hardly worth remembering. There were wars to fight, trade routes to establish, and more interesting scandals to discuss. 16 standard months passed. The base settled into the swamp, becoming less of a structure and more of an artificial reef. Native life forms began reclaiming the space with the enthusiasm of squatters who knew the landlord was not coming back. Vines covered walls, water pooled in corridors. Things nested in the command center. Verath 9 returned to its previous status, completely and utterly ignored by the wider galaxy. This was exactly when Hank Bowman entered the picture. Hank was a cargo hauler, which was a polite way of saying he moved things from one place to another for people who did not ask too many questions about origin or destination. He flew a freighter called the Mud Skipper, which was a ship that had been old when his grandfather bought it and had somehow achieved a state of mechanical existence that could only be described as spite-based. The ship should have fallen apart decades ago by any reasonable assessment. It stayed together mostly because its various components were too stubborn to fail simultaneously, and because Hank had developed a relationship with the machinery that was equal parts maintenance and negotiation. On the day that changed everything, Hank was 3 jumps out from a delivery that was definitely legal and absolutely did not involve circumventing agricultural import restrictions on Terran coffee beans, when the Mudskipper's hyperdrive made a noise that no hyperdrive should ever make. It was somewhere between a grinding sound and a scream, with harmonic overtones that suggested the machinery was composing a final farewell ballad. Sparks shot from a panel. Smoke filled the engine compartment. Warning lights illuminated across every console in a display that would have been pretty if it was not so terrifying. Hank, who had extensive experience with ships trying to kill him through various mechanical failures, immediately dropped out of hyperspace. This turned out to be both wise and unfortunate. Wise, because the hyperdrive would have exploded approximately 30 seconds later, turning him and the Mudskipper into an expanding cloud of very small particles. Unfortunate, because he dropped into normal space in a sector he did not recognize, with a ship that could barely maintain life support, let alone propulsion or navigation. The emergency beacon, one of the few systems still functioning, led him to Verath 9, which his outdated navigation database listed as a potential safe harbor with abandoned facilities. The fact that it was listed as abandoned was, in Hank's current situation, actually a selling point. The last thing he needed was explaining to authorities why his cargo hold smelled strongly of coffee when his manifest claimed machine parts. He coaxed the Mudskipper down through the atmosphere with the kind of piloting that was equal parts skill and prayer, talking to the ship like a beloved but stubborn pet. The descent was not smooth. Several systems failed in ways that were creative and concerning, but he managed to touch down in what had once been the Krynn base's main landing zone and was now a relatively flat section of mud that accepted the ship with a squelching sound that suggested resignation. Hank sat in the cockpit for a solid 5 minutes after landing, listening to the ship's death rattle and the ambient sounds of the swamp outside. Things chirped, things splashed, things made noises that defied categorization. Then he laughed, because sometimes that was the only appropriate response to complete disaster. His hyperdrive was slag, cooling metal that would never jump again. His communication array had apparently melted into modern art. His emergency beacon had enough power to reach maybe half a light year, which meant exactly nobody was hearing it. He was stranded. Completely, thoroughly stranded. Hank grabbed his tools, his emergency supplies that included enough rations for a month if he was careful, and his lucky fishing rod that he kept, because optimism was important, even in a profession that regularly involved dodging customs inspections. He stepped out into the swamp. The smell hit him first. It was organic, vigorous, and absolutely alive. Decomposition and growth happening simultaneously. Rich earth and standing water and vegetation living its best life. Hank, who had grown up near the Mississippi Delta and had spent his teenage years fishing in bayous that tourists avoided because they valued their lives, inhaled deeply and grinned. It smelled like home. It smelled like summer afternoons and successful fishing trips, and the kind of wild places that civilization had not yet ruined. The abandoned Krynn base sprawled across several acres, slowly surrendering to the swamp, but still substantially intact. Hank spent 2 days exploring, cataloging what was available, and making plans. The Krynn had left behind building materials, power cells that still held charges, fabrication equipment, and enough military-grade infrastructure to build a small city. They had abandoned it all because they were miserable. Hank was not miserable. Hank saw opportunity. The first project was the dock. The Krynn landing platform extended out over deeper water, and Hank quickly realized it was almost perfectly positioned for fishing. He salvaged decking from the base's interior walls, materials designed to withstand combat and heavy equipment. He used structural supports that were rated to hold military vehicles weighing several tons. He constructed a dock that could probably survive a direct artillery strike, solid and level, extending 30 feet out into the water with convenient spots for sitting and adequate space for cleaning fish. The dock took 4 days to complete, working from sunrise to sunset. Hank celebrated by attempting to fish, using his lucky rod and some improvised bait made from ration packs that he figured the fish would not be picky about. Within 20 minutes, he hooked something that fought like it had personal grievances. 10 minutes of battle later, he hauled up a creature that looked like a cross between a catfish and an eel, measured 3 feet long, and had a face that suggested it was deeply offended by the concept of being caught. Hank cleaned it, cooked it over a fire made from dried alien equipment crates, and discovered that it tasted absolutely magnificent. Buttery, firm, with a flavor that was somewhere between salmon and lobster. He sat on his new dock, eating fresh fish and watching the sunset turn the swamp water gold, and decided that maybe he would stay a while longer. The fishing lines came next. The Krynn had left behind communication cables, thin braided fiber, designed to carry data across hostile environments without degradation. Hank recognized good fishing line when he saw it, even if it was rated for military encryption rather than catching dinner. He spent a week setting up multiple lines at various points along the dock and the shoreline, creating a small network of passive fishing stations. Every morning he would check them, and every morning he would find at least 3 or 4 catches waiting. The swamp was alive with fish, big ones that required 2 hands to lift, small ones perfect for a quick meal, ones that looked normal, and ones that looked like evolution had been experimenting with recreational substances. Hank caught them all, learned which were good eating and which were better used as bait, and settled into a routine that felt more natural than anything he had done in years. 6 weeks after landing, Hank admitted to himself that he was not leaving. The mudskipper was never flying again, but why would he want it to? He had food, water, shelter, and more peace than he had known in his entire adult life. What he did not have was a proper house. The Krynn base provided the solution. The structure was modular, designed for rapid deployment and reconfiguration. Hank spent 2 weeks planning his design, 1 week fabricating components, and 3 weeks constructing. He built his house on stilts, because building at ground level in a swamp was for people who enjoyed flooding and mosquitoes. The stilts were made from structural supports rated to hold armored vehicles. The platform they supported was 30 feet square, elevated 8 feet above the normal water line, and absolutely solid. The walls came from base partition panels, insulated and weatherproof and bearing scorch marks from whatever the Krynn had been doing inside. The roof was a marvel of salvaged materials, solar panels for power, rain collection systems for water, and enough structural integrity to laugh at storms. Inside, Hank created exactly what he needed: a main room with a cooking area featuring a salvaged heating unit, a sleeping loft accessible by a ladder, storage space for food and equipment, and a covered porch that overlooked the water and caught the evening breeze. The house took 2 months to complete. When it was done, Hank stood on the porch with a cup of coffee made from supplies he had been carefully rationing, looked out over his dock and his fishing lines and his swamp, and felt a satisfaction that most people spend their entire lives seeking without ever finding. He had power from the solar panels and salvaged Krynn energy cells that would last years. He had water from rain and a filtration system made from base equipment that could purify anything short of industrial waste. He had food from the swamp, which provided fish, edible plants that tasted surprisingly good, and even something that was remarkably similar to rice growing wild near the shore. He had shelter that was comfortable, dry, and sturdy enough to survive anything the weather could throw at it. He had everything he needed, and absolutely nothing he did not. Time passed the way it does when life is simple and good. Days blended into weeks. Hank fished in the mornings when the fish were biting. He cooked elaborate meals because he had the time and the ingredients. He read books on his ancient data pad, technical manuals and adventure novels downloaded years ago. He occasionally talked to himself just to keep his conversation skills fresh, conducting entire debates about the best way to smoke fish, or whether the thing he saw last Tuesday was a log or something more interesting. He expanded the dock, adding another section for different fishing spots. He built a smokehouse for preserving fish, a small structure that filled the air with delicious smells. He started a garden using hydroponics equipment and seeds from his emergency supplies, growing tomatoes and peppers that thrived under the grow lights. He even brewed beer because the swamp provided something remarkably similar to grain, and because some traditions were too important to abandon even at the edge of civilization. It was peaceful, quiet except for the sounds of nature, perfect in a way that defied explanation. This perfection lasted for 7 months before the galaxy rediscovered Verith 9. The patrol ship was Velcarian, a species known for thoroughness and mild obsessive tendencies that made them excellent at jobs requiring attention to detail. Their routine sensor sweep of abandoned military installations detected life signs where there should be none. This was concerning enough to warrant investigation. Unauthorized occupation of former military sites could indicate smugglers, pirates, or any number of problems that required official attention. Captain Thross led the investigation team personally, along with 2 security officers built like tanks and a xenobiologist who specialized in contamination scenarios. They approached the planet with weapons charged and shields active, prepared for anything from hostile takeover to biological outbreak. What they found was Hank, sitting on his dock, fishing. The Valkyrian shuttle descended with appropriate military precision, landing on the remains of the old Krynn platform. Captain Thross emerged wearing full combat armor and carrying enough firepower to level a small building. He scanned the area with professional efficiency, identified the human sitting calmly by the water, and experienced the unique confusion of having absolutely no context for what he was seeing. Hank noticed the shuttle, considered reeling in his line because politeness was important, decided the fish were biting too well to interrupt, and waved casually instead. Captain Thross approached cautiously, his translator working overtime to process human language. "You are aware this is restricted territory." Hank looked up, smiled in a friendly way that suggested he had not seen another person in months, and was genuinely happy about it, and shrugged. Nobody was using it. Figured finders keepers. The captain examined the dock, noting its construction quality. He examined the house, visible through the trees. He examined the fishing lines and the small garden. "You are living here. Been about 7 months now. Good fishing." Hank's line tugged, and he focused on reeling in a particularly feisty catch. "You folks staying for dinner? Got plenty." The xenobiologist, who had been scanning the environment with increasing disbelief, spoke up. "Captain, this planet is classified as uninhabitable. The Krynn abandoned it due to environmental hostility." Hank landed the fish, a respectable 5-pounder with scales that shimmered purple in the light. "Yeah, found their stuff. They didn't seem to like it much. Left some great building materials, though." He held up the fish admiringly. "This is a beautiful specimen. These taste amazing if you smoke them right." Captain Thross tried again. "The Krynn Empire maintained a military installation here for 3 months. They reported extensive equipment failure, medical issues, and complete operational compromise due to environmental factors." Hank began cleaning the fish with practiced efficiency, his knife moving with the skill of someone who had done this thousands of times. "I mean, they probably shouldn't have tried to fight the swamp. You got to work with it, not against it." He gestured around with the knife. "Everything I built uses the environment. Solar power, rain collection, local food, easy living once you adapt." The security officers exchanged glances that conveyed entire conversations. The xenobiologist's scanner was insisting that the environmental conditions should be causing severe discomfort at minimum. The human appeared to be thriving in a way that contradicted all available data. "You are alone here?" the captain asked. "Just me and the fish. And whatever those things are that howl at night, but they keep their distance after I threw rocks at them a few times." Hank finished cleaning the fish and stood wiping his hands on a cloth. "Seriously, you folks want dinner? I've got a stew going that's been simmering all day, and I just harvested some greens that are surprisingly good when you cook them right." The invitation was so genuinely friendly, so completely unexpected, that Captain Thross found himself accepting before his military training could object. An hour later, the investigation team sat in Hank's house, eating fish stew that was legitimately excellent, and trying to reconcile their reality with their expectations. The house was comfortable, well-built and organized. The food was excellent, better than military rations by several orders of magnitude. The human was completely inexplicably content, telling stories about his fishing adventures like this was the most normal situation in the galaxy. The xenobiologist kept scanning, his device beeping quietly. "I do not understand." The conditions here should be deeply unpleasant for carbon-based life forms. The humidity alone should be causing respiratory issues. Hank laughed, a warm sound that filled the small house. Unpleasant, this is paradise. Nobody bothers me, fish are plentiful, weather's warm year-round. I grew up in Louisiana. This is basically home with better fishing. The Krynn reported equipment failures at an unprecedented rate, one security officer noted, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had read the entire file. Well, yeah, they brought a bunch of overcomplicated military gear into a wet environment. That's just asking for corrosion and shorts. Hank gestured at his setup with pride. I kept it simple. Use what works, adapt what doesn't, and respect the environment you're in. That's just common sense. Captain Thross filed his report that evening, writing and rewriting it 4 times because it sounded insane every way he phrased it. The summary was simple. Human located on Verath 9, living comfortably in conditions that defeated an entire Krynn military installation, appears happy and refuses to leave, also makes excellent stew. The report spread through galactic databases with the speed of genuinely bizarre news. The Krynn Empire initially refused to believe it, then sent their own investigation team, then spent weeks in meetings trying to explain how conditions that had broken trained soldiers were perfectly acceptable to one cargo hauler with a fishing rod and common sense. Scientists proposed theories with increasing desperation. Perhaps humans had unique adaptations to high humidity environments. Perhaps the specific human was somehow exceptional in ways that defied normal biology. Perhaps the Krynn had simply been unlucky with equipment batches. Each theory was less convincing than the last, contradicted by the simple fact that one guy was living comfortably where an army had failed. The truth which nobody wanted to admit because it was embarrassing for highly advanced civilizations was simpler. Hank had approached the swamp as something to live with rather than something to conquer. He had adapted instead of fighting. He had found peace instead of trying to impose order. He had succeeded through simplicity where sophistication had failed. Other humans began visiting after word spread through the community, having heard about the guy who made paradise out of a planet that defeated an empire. Some stayed a few days enjoying the fishing and the quiet and the sense of being somewhere genuinely peaceful. Others tried to settle but found they preferred more amenities like reliable internet and restaurants. Hank welcomed them all, shared his fish and his beer that turned out pretty good, and was equally content when they left. He had never been particularly social anyway. 6 months after the discovery, galactic databases updated Verath 9's classification again. It now read, Abandoned Krynn installation, uninhabitable, except apparently for humans. Approach with confusion and possibly humility. Hank, completely unaware of the diplomatic discussions and scientific debates his existence had triggered across a dozen worlds, sat on his dock on a warm evening and cast his line. The sun was setting, painting the swamp in shades of orange and gold that would make a professional artist weep. Something splashed in the distance, possibly another of those big ones. Something else howled from the shore, one of those things that stayed away. His line tugged with the promise of dinner. He smiled, reeled it in slowly to avoid breaking the line, and thought about expanding the guest dock for visitors. Maybe adding another room to the house for storage. Perhaps attempting to brew something stronger than beer now that he had the process down. The galaxy could keep its empires and its military installations, and its classifications, and its complicated explanations. Hank had everything he needed right here. A good dock, reliable fishing lines, and a home on stilts in the middle of a swamp that everyone else had been too sophisticated to appreciate. Sometimes the difference between paradise and hell was just a matter of perspective and willingness to adapt. The Krynn had seen a strategic location that happened to be miserable. Hank had seen a home that happened to be peaceful. In the end, the swamp had not changed. Only the expectations had. And somewhere in the Krynn Imperial archives, Commander Vectis learned about the human on Vereth 9, and laughed for the first time in years, a deep belly laugh that his colleagues found disturbing. Then he filed a formal request for reassignment to absolutely anywhere else, because some ironies were too painful to contemplate, especially when they involved being defeated by a planet that one human considered a vacation spot.